Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us on this very special occasion. Thank you for joining us for the final public event of the Times of Crisis lectures. It's such a pleasure to see so many colleagues and students and community members gather here to hear one of our country's finest minds, that of philosopher, public intellectual, cultural critic, activist organizer, the distinguished Professor Emerita in the History of Consciousness and Feminist Studies departments at the University of California, Santa Cruz, Professor Angela Davis. A small group of us had the honor of having lunch with her today, so we want to thank you, Angela, for the time you spent with us and for your thoughtfulness and your answering our questions. Thank you. Professor Davis's visit to Dartmouth comes under the auspices of the Times of Crisis lecture series, research seminar, and undergraduate course, our three-legged approach to the Gender Research Institute. This is an experimental model of inhabiting academic space at our institution. The Women's and Gender Studies program at Dartmouth has had a long history of thinking about the connections between pedagogy, research, and social change. After all, Women's and Gender Studies is a program with more than 70 faculty that engage in gender-related research and teaching, and it's a program that develops the critical skills of over 600 students each year. Many years of debate of the Women's and Gender Studies faculty guided the conversation of how to best combine the good work on gender that already takes place and provide an institutional structure to enhance it and connect it with social activism. And we wanted to think outside the box, for if Women's and Gender Studies has a brand, it's making the conventional uncomfortable. Hence our wish to link teaching, research, social engagement, something that does raise eyebrows on occasion. So after nearly 3 years of preliminary work, we inaugurated the Gender Research Institute this fall. I'm Annabelle Martin, a faculty member in Women's and Gender Studies in Spanish and Comparative Literature, and I have the honor and privilege of being the Institute's first director. I'm surrounded by a team of indefatigable colleagues, the GRID development team who worked on the dream, Professors Amy Allen, Lisa Valdez, Jennifer Fleury, and Veronica Fuchner, and today joined by Dr. Susan Pepin, Professor Ross Virginia, and Daniel Benjamin, the director of the Dickey Center, on our GRID steering committee. Deadlines are met, schedules are kept, organizational building and planning keeps on course thanks to the very hard work of our office manager, Nancy O'Brien. Nancy? Nancy? And the support she gets from our unbelievably dedicated interns, Stephanie Chavez-Yenter, Jennifer Gargano, and Tanita Zubi. Tanita being one of our international fellows from the University of Pristina in Kosovo. GRID's international projection is gaining momentum and recognition given how 2 months ago the Institute won a multi-year and substantial USAID grant for leadership development work with our colleagues at the University of Pristina in their Gender Studies and Gender Research Institute. None of this would have been possible without the unwavering support of many people in the Dartmouth administration, especially from former President Carol Folt, who urged us to envision something grand around gender at Dartmouth. Some of you might recall that as part of her legacy last year, President Folt set aside generous funding for GRID's initial pilot years, a 4-year experiment in a project that wishes to bring together Dartmouth's gender-related work in all of its divisions and across the professional schools. GRID's core is interdisciplinary, our focus is domestic and international, and our goal is to be effective translators of these qualities into our teaching, our research, and our linkages with civil society. GRID also receives stewardship from the Office of the Provost as we work closely with Vice Provost for International Initiatives, Professor Lindsay Whaley, who has agreed to say a few words today, and with the Office of the Dean of Faculty, for we are also advised by the Associate Dean of International and Interdisciplinary Programs, Lynn Higgins, and by, of course, the Dean of Faculty, Mike Mastanduno. Now, the Times of Crisis lectures began on April 10th, And they have brought together throughout spring term students, faculty, staff, and community members like you interested in hearing our guests speak about the struggles of social change, about the place for dignity and social justice, about formulating change as a multidimensional, fertile, and tense dialogue between issues of class, race, sexuality, gender, ethnicity, language, legality. We learned from Dennis Goldberg, one of the South African historical leaders of the ANC and political prisoner for 22 years in the fight against apartheid, how it was possible and necessary to intersect racial with class struggle, both in the South Africa of the 1960s and today. We listened to John Berger and spoke with Professor Noam Chomsky on the power of the imagination, on the power of words, art, creation, for addressing and embodying the notion of crisis as a new political imaginary for our times. This event was followed by the visit of Amy Goodman, distinguished journalist of Democracy Now!, who with her eloquence and storytelling brought to life that silenced majority that is fiercely combating the inequities that surround us, but that never receive the immediate attention they deserve for fear that solidarity might cross facile identity lines. War photographer James Nakwe's stunning photographs sparked a profound discussion on the linkage between photography and social activism, as well as how nuanced the concept of witnessing and memory need to be in order for there to be a closeness to truth in his work of documenting disaster. Feminist philosopher Nancy Fraser visited next and offered us a conceptual paradigm particularly relevant to the heart and soul of the ethos behind the Gender Research Institute, in that she made it very clear that in times of crisis like ours, we will never fully understand the historical implications of these times, nor begin to imagine a site of contestation and change without rethinking old concepts, old familiar paradigms. For example, and she challenged us to think between the linkages between capitalism, neoliberalism, and feminism itself. A talk that framed and allowed us to better understand the underlying assumptions behind the market and agency theory of the uncomfortable brand of feminism that institutions like the World Bank espouse in their gender and development operations, as was illustrated in the reports that were graciously shared with us by the director of this sector of the bank, Jennifer Klugman, in her visit here this past Monday. Now, I can think of no better person to end the series than Professor Angela Davis, a scholar activist who explicates in her book, The Meaning of Freedom, that feminism is a radical practice closely linked to the fertility embedded in the notion of crisis, if you understand crisis as the concept of constant change and instability. Let me share with you a quote from this book that the GRID Fellows discussed in our preparatory seminar on Wednesday. Professor Davis, this is the book that I'm quoting from. Professor Davis affirms, instability and crisis can be productive if we are willing to dwell within the interstices of the instabilities. Feminist methodologies for research and for organizing impel us to explore contradictions that are not always apparent. They drive us to inhabit contradictions and discover what is productive in these contradictions and methods of thought and action. They urge us to think things together that appear to be entirely separate, and to disaggregate things that appear to belong naturally together. One way of embodying this notion of disaggregate thinking is through the metaphor of fracture. And I would like to conclude with a very short clip by Colombian sculptor Dori Salcedo and her imagining crisis as a cement fracture for the Tate Gallery in London, a beautiful embodiment of what GRID hopes is its social and ethical and educational ethos. Let me show you this clip, it's very short.
Before I thought of the piece, what struck me was the attitude of people that were walking in the space. Everybody looked up and they felt like it was an amazing space. And I was thinking, it's not that extraordinary. It's an industrial, modernist space. There are many, many more. It's not like you are entering Hagia Sophia or you're in front of the pyramids in Egypt. But people had that impression. And I thought it was unbelievably narcissistic. So what I wanted to do was to turn upside down that perspective. And instead of looking up, you have to look down as a way of seeing reality. So I wanted to inscribe in this modernist, rationalist building an image that was somehow chaotic and that marked a negative space. Because I believe there is a bottomless gap that divides humanity from inhumanity or whites from non-whites. So I wanted to address that gap. And I thought that gap was mainly perceived in the history of modernity. When you read the history of modernity, it is narrated as an only European event. Nobody else participated in that. And the ideas of colonialism, of imperialism, are marginalized, to say the least. So I wanted this history of racism to come up, because I believe the history of racism, it's the untold dark side of the history of modernity. That's why I wanted this crack to break the building and to intrude in the building almost the same way a non-white immigrant intrudes in the sameness and consensus of white society. Shibboleth, it's a word that I took from Judges in the Bible. They describe this war between two Israeli tribes. The tribe that lost the war was attempting to cross the Jordan River to escape, and as they were crossing the river, they would request to pronounce the word Shibboleth. They could not pronounce it like that, and they pronounced it Siboleth. At that point, the Bible described a huge massacre. 42,000 people were killed right there. So I used the word because I was referring to the experience of racism, of the experience of crossing borders, the experience of the immigrant. So what it is to die making this attempt at crossing a border. The word that defines my work is impotence. I am completely impotent. I feel that I am responsible for everything that happens and that I simply arrive too late. I cannot give anybody back their father or their son. I cannot fix any problem. I can do nothing. It's a lack of power. But then, as a person who lacks power, I face the ones who have power and who manipulate life. It's from that perspective of the one who lacks power that I look at the powerful ones and at their deeds.
So, crisis, change, tension, cracks. It is our hope that the Gender Research Institute has facilitated these passionate lessons in democracy this term for you. So, thank you very much, and I'd like to invite Lindsay Whaley to say a few words. Thank you.
Well, it's certainly a treat to be with all of you here this afternoon, and a privilege for me to be able to offer just a few remarks on behalf of the institution on this opening of the final event of GRID's Spring Series, Times of Crisis. And as Annabelle just reflected, what an impressive series this has been. We've really had an opportunity to have conversations, I'd like to say, through the lens of gender about social activism, about capitalism, about economic development and opportunity, about political resistance, and about war. And all of these things have spoken quite broadly to the times of crisis that we experience now in our contemporary culture and our contemporary world. Indeed, has been a powerful series, and one that I'm excited to have hosted here at Dartmouth's campus. And how fitting it is to have as our cleanup hitter, so to speak, Angela Davis. We are very thankful to you for traveling from sunny California to not so sunny Hanover on this particular festive day. I have to say, there was a moment this afternoon at about 1 p.m. where I said, I hope people come. This is Green Key weekend. It's a nice day. The fact that this room is filled just again speaks to the power of your voice and the importance of what you have to say, but I think also reflects on the power of Dartmouth. And when we're at our best, spending a warm Friday afternoon thinking through serious issues in an important way. So thank you for all being here. I do want to say on behalf of Interim Provost Martin Wyburn and President Hanlon welcome both of them. I ran into both of them this morning, and they expressed frustration with the fact that this is an alumni council weekend. It's also a board meeting of both the Thayer School and the Geisel School, and by virtue of their professional obligations, they can't be here, but they wanted to be here, and I say that in a heartfelt sense, that they really felt this was an important event and one that they wish they could have been at. I'd also like to thank Annabelle Martin and the GRID Steering Committee for doing such a great job with GRID this spring and beyond. The concept of something like GRID has actually been around at Dartmouth for many, many years, been tossed around in different forms and in different ways. But it was on August 17th, 2012, that there was actually a formal pitch made by Annabelle and some of her colleagues to then interim president Carol Folt, dean of faculty Mike Mastanduno, many of his colleagues, to establish GRID as we know it. And that meeting was a very productive and constructive one. I was there. There were a lot of hard questions asked. But the general sense was the time is right for something like GRID to be at Dartmouth, and a lot of excitement. So while the tough questions were there, they're really around logistics. And at something which approaches light speed in the world of higher education, just 5 months later, a commitment was made to launch GRID. And now we're reaping those benefits. It's quite exciting. I think at the core, as Annabelle expressed, GRID is about marrying the power of social activism with the creativity and power of the intellect and how one might apply the category of gender to understanding the individual and understanding our world. And that marriage of activism and thought was one that captured everybody in that room on August 17th as something that we wanted at Dartmouth. But there were two further aspects of it that personally really resonated for me in terms of the potential for this institute, this series going forward, to really have an impact here at Dartmouth and beyond. And let me just mention those briefly. The first is that GRID is self-consciously interdisciplinary. I think it's not a surprise to anybody in this room that while the construction of gender for the individual is complicated enough, when we start thinking about the manifold and multi-layered ways in which gender operates within social systems at Dartmouth, in our state, in our nation, and around the world, it becomes almost unimaginable to make any progress in thinking through that lens without bringing together the perspectives of many different disciplines to bear on these questions. It needs to be an interdisciplinary exercise. And the way that GRID plans to play itself out in this interdisciplinary sphere at Dartmouth is also very exciting to me, in that it's bringing together lots of different constituencies which are geographically very close but not always working together. So with GRID, we hope to see the combination of many different arts and sciences programs and departments and thinking through issues of our day through the lens of gender. We hope to see the professional schools participating with arts and sciences in this discussion. And we also hope to see that the undergraduates will come together not only with faculty members, but also with our graduate students and our postdoctoral fellows and our staff and our administration in the discussions. It's interdisciplinary, or at least interdepartmental, in a lot of important ways. A second distinguishing feature of GRID, which I'm very excited about, is that it is self-consciously international in its perspective. You know, from the outset, GRID has sought to bring to campus fellows from overseas. Particularly exciting, as Annabelle mentioned, has been this emerging relationship between scholars in Kosovo and the United States. But I don't think it will stop just there. I think there's a real potential to partner with people around the world in thinking through these issues in an international context. So given these points of focus, social activism and intellectual inquiry, interdisciplinary internationalism, I'm frankly just eager to see what the next few years hold for GRID and Dartmouth in this diverse combination of disciplines and people and conversations that we're going to have, and the ways that it will impact our campus and beyond. So with that, I would like to bring back Annabelle to the podium to introduce Amy Bong and get this started. So thank you all. Thank you for being here.
Amy doesn't want this, but too bad, Amy. Now it's my treat to introduce Professor Amy Bang to you, Spring Grid Fellow, who'll be introducing Angela Davis together with two student Grid Fellows, Samarli Jarrett and Christine Miguel. Amy is a faculty member in the Department of English, and she also teaches in Women's and Gender Studies, in Asian and Middle Eastern Studies, and Asian American Studies at Dartmouth. She is a much admired colleague with a sharp and incisive mind and a great sense of humor, and motivated by a pedagogical and political ethos that make her have rock star following among our students. Amy likes to think of herself as teaching in the intersection of feminist science and technological studies, transnational Asian American studies, and queer theory. She's finishing a book titled Speculative Acts in Neoliberal Times that investigates how stories about the future, whether they emerge from science fiction or economic projects, kind of the same thing, bear a complicated relationship to Orientalist imaginaries. Given her training and interests, Amy teaches a wide array of courses here in the areas of U.S. ethnic literatures and cultures, speculative science fiction, popular culture, gender and sexuality studies, feminist science and technology studies, cinema and film theory, critical studies on globalization, labor and empire, and etc. So I cherish working with her, and I know that it is a widely held feeling amongst us all. So, Amy.
Thank you. I will try and make this as short as possible without being disrespectful, because it is with the greatest respect that I want to introduce our speaker today. It is my deepest honor and pleasure to introduce our guest this afternoon, world-renowned author, scholar, activist Angela Davis, Professor Emerita at the University of California, Santa Cruz for over 4 decades. She's been one of the most influential activists and intellectuals in the United States, and I have to admit, it's somewhat strange to have to introduce such an American icon. But for the few of you who may only be familiar with Angela Davis as an icon of the Black liberation movement of the 1960s, I hope today we might be able to free Angela from that fairly one-dimensional figuration of the And actually, some of the pressure of introducing Angela Davis is off now, because her remarkable life journey has been chronicled recently in a documentary titled Free Angela and All Political Prisoners, directed by Joel Lynch. As we near the time of year when many of our graduating seniors are thinking about the what next question, I've been talking to my students about what it might mean to reorganize their lives, not along the all too familiar narrative of graduating, getting a job, accruing capital, and or more likely debt and more debt, getting married, buying a home, having children, and eventually retiring, but along a radically more imaginative trajectory of dedicating oneself to a life's work. Angela Davis, in my humble opinion, is a shining example of committing oneself to a life's work in transformative justice and the struggle for social change. Perhaps what has always moved me most about Angela Davis's life work has been her unwavering attention to the intersectionality of the many movements to which she has lent her voice. While radical Black feminism may be her headquarters, she has turned her scholarly and activist attentions to a range of issues: homophobia, reproductive freedom, economic justice, prison abolition, public education, apartheid, nuclear disarmament, sweatshops in Asia, and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It's possible that her ability to see the connections among violences exacted across identificatory lines might have been first exercised during her childhood in Birmingham, Alabama, a place where Jim Crow and McCarthyism converged and rendered evident to a 6-year-old Angela Davis just how racist and punishing the police and the FBI could be to those the state benefited from silencing. I also understand Angela Davis to be an example of a student who took her learning so seriously that she literally took her learning on the road to places where she could gain access to what she wanted to read and find the people with whom she wanted to think, at institutions where segregation would be less of an impediment. In 1959, she left Birmingham to finish her high school years in New York City, where she attended the Elizabeth Irwin School. And at the age of 16, began reading Marx, Engels, and the Communist Manifesto. She then went to Brandeis University, just down the road in Massachusetts, which afforded her the opportunity to continue her studies abroad in Finland, France, and Germany, where she spent 2 years at Goethe University in Frankfurt, thinking alongside Theodor Adorno and Herbert Marcuse. It was in Paris that she heard about the bombings back in Birmingham in 1963. This was a heartbreakingly pivotal moment, and in the ensuing years, Davis would bring her training in critical theory together in powerful ways with the activist groups she joined, including SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and the Black Panther Party. By this point, Davis had completed her undergraduate work, graduating magna cum laude, no less, from Brandeis in 1965, and decided to follow her mentor, Herbert Marcuse, to pursue her graduate degree at the University of California at San Diego. At UCSD, you may or may not know, at least for graduate students in the literature department where I received my own PhD, we watched Herbert's Hippopotamus, a quirky documentary about the political collaborations between Angela Davis and Marcuse, as part of our disorientation week. The documentary tells the story of a radical student movement that sought to bring curricular change that would take the shape of a Lumumba Zapata college, which would include not only ethnic studies courses as part of its core curriculum, but would also entail, amazing, a multi-ethnic student admissions committee aimed at attracting a student population that was 35% Black and 35% Mexican American. Though the name never got pushed through as such, the members of the Black Student Council and MECHA, in conjunction with faculty and graduate student support in the form of Angela Davis, Herbert Marcuse, and Carlos Blanco, took over the registrar's office and issued their demands, eventually resulting in UCSD's third college, now named Thurgood Marshall College. It was during my years at UCSD that we formed a new Lumumba Zapata coalition in 2007 to demand a curricular reinvigoration of the Dimensions of Culture undergraduate core sequence at Thurgood Marshall College, the radical politics of which had been slowly but surely dismantled during the 80s and 90s. I tell this story partially to map a trajectory for me as a scholar, scholar activist also, who came up through an institution much like Dartmouth. I did my undergraduate degree at Princeton. And in the mid-1990s, a cross-ethnic coalition between the Asian American student organizations and the Chicano Caucus took over the president's office and demanded curricular change. You know where I'm going with this, I guess. Because it is in our contemporary moment that we live and breathe another necessary interventionist taking over the president's office in order to demand those kinds of curricular change and social change and campus climate change, right? So just to give you a little bit of an idea of the kinds of key critical works the LZC fought to reincorporate into the Thurgood Marshall program. I'm going to recite a little bit of our dream curriculum, which largely includes Professor Davis's life work in the form of her 9 published books, which include If They Come in the Morning, Voices of Resistance, co-edited by Bettina Apteker, Angela Davis, an autobiography. It's these seminal Black feminist texts, Women, Race, and Class, Women, Culture, and Politics, and one of my favorites, and way too often overlooked, Blues, Legacies, and Black Feminism. And of course, her more recent work, Are Prisons Obsolete? Abolition, Democracy, Beyond Prisons, Torture, and Empire, and The Meaning of Freedom. Professor Davis's turn to prison abolition can't be easily narrativized as emerging from her own incarceration in 1970. where she was arrested and charged with and faced the death penalty for 3 capital crimes: murder, kidnapping, and conspiracy. Of course, 3 charges that she was acquitted of in 1972. But I am particularly heartened by these journeys and these articulations of movements of personal experience and movements in the political realm. And I am particularly excited by the way in which Professor Davis's sustained critique of the abuses of privatization as neoliberalism hitches itself to ever more global forms of capitalism is beginning to emerge now. Professor Davis will be speaking today on feminism and abolition, extending the dialogue. And in a way, I'd like to extend my own dialogue, and I apologize, but this will be short and sweet, to another set of introductions. And I find this very important because I think Professor Davis has always been really vocal about shifting the focus to the younger generation of student activists. And it's in that spirit that I'd like to call up 2 of our own student activists whose lives you've touched, Angela, and whose work you've inspired: Chris McGill and Samarli Jarrett.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Okay. As young activists, we are often told that we are idealistic in our visions of change. This has often led to disillusionment and undermines our freedom dreams. We have been told that the structures in place have always been there, so we shouldn't fight against them, but rather we should fight with them. We are told to work within the structures of capitalism and that poverty is a natural state of competition. We are told to work within the hierarchies of patriarchy because biology makes us inherently different. We are told that the United States is exceptional and that it is our job to spread freedom and democracy.
But we are well aware that the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. We are well aware that the meritocracy on which capitalism is grounded is riddled with violence and on the exploitation of people of color, women, queer folks, and the poor. We are well aware that neoliberal ideologies of glass ceiling and lean-in feminism homogenizes the complexities of what it means to be a woman. We are well aware that freedom and democracy in the United States is an illusion, and spreading these ideas are just a larger part of the US colonialist, imperialist expansion project.
Thankfully, we no longer believe that our visions of change, or rather, our freedom dreams, are idealistic or impossible. We have found inspiration through Dr. Davis's work on prison abolition, her belief in the power of reimagining liberation and freedom, and her resilience in the fight for change.
At Dartmouth and beyond, we must challenge ourselves to relentlessly fight for justice on multiple scales and levels. We must make this fight a part of our everyday existence, for our survival is dependent upon its fulfillment. In her speech delivered this past February at Southern Illinois University, Dr. Davis makes this clear. She says, "You have to act as if it were possible to radically transform the world, and you have to do it all the time." Please join us in welcoming activist, author, professor, daughter,
Sister, change agent, radical liberator,
and our inspiration, Dr. Angela Davis.
Well, thank you so much. As I sat there, I was hoping that both Amy and Chris and Samarli would continue because I was enjoying their presentation so much, forgetting that it had anything at all to do with me. But let me say that it is really an honor to participate in this series, Times of Crisis, and I'd like to thank Annabelle Martin and the new Gender Research Institute of Dartmouth for inviting me to participate. And I learned about some of the people who have preceded me during this series, and so I can say that those are some real hard acts to follow with John Berger and Noam Chomsky. Actually, Noam Chomsky and I did a dialogue this time last year, I believe it was, in Boston. And Amy Goodman, Nancy Fraser, and all of the others. And I really appreciated the fact that you showed the video by Doris Salcedo. She is an amazing artist. So I am going to try not to speak so long. I have a tendency to be long-winded, which I really hate. So first I'm going to see if I can find my timer. No, actually, I think I'll do a stopwatch. So I know exactly how long I've been speaking. Good. Now, 2 seconds. And I'm not counting the introduction. But I would really like to save some time for an exchange. We had a really wonderful conversation over lunch, and I'd like to continue that. I'm going to focus this afternoon. Actually, it's quite pleasant here in Dartmouth. It is so hot in California now. It was over 100 in LA. I was at UCLA teaching on Wednesday, so it's a relief to be here. But I have been thinking about possible articulations of feminism and abolition, and the scholarly and activist directions these articulations might signal for quite some time. What can feminism offer abolition, and what can abolition offer feminism? What might be enabled on the new epistemological horizons generated by this articulation? And of course, this exploration can only occur within an interdisciplinary frame, within a broadly constructed interdisciplinarity. So I want to go beyond the traditional academic disciplines in this conception of interdisciplinarity to a framework that values activist venues as sites of knowledge production as well. And that, of course, relies on feminist studies, certainly, but also on the emergent field, critical prison studies. And I have to say that I'm somewhat ambivalent about that field. As hard as we have worked to legitimize it as a field, that is to say, to take the object of the prison from the conventional disciplines that have owned it. Actually, you might begin with political science, but political science doesn't even remember its own origins. And I mean, this is nothing against the political scientists. I have a former student, wonderful student in politics, who wrote an amazing dissertation about that trajectory. Because we forget often that there was a period before the disciplines had become so specialist. As a matter of fact, here I go off script again. But as a matter of fact, when we think about the work of Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois, and that work is situated within so many disciplines, political science, sociology, et cetera. This is actually before the disciplines themselves claim their space, but let me see if I can go back on script. I was talking about critical prison studies and the fact that I'm somewhat ambivalent, and I actually want to retain that ambivalence, particularly since I've had the opportunity to witness the institutionalization of many radical fields or fields with radical origins that now are, that bear very little difference with respect to other academic disciplines. I'm not going to do a critique of Black studies and a lot of women's studies, gender studies programs, but let me say that critical prison studies has to be capable of imagining its own demise. Just as we think about the aim of abolition as a world which no longer requires the existence of prisons, we will also have to think about this field called critical prison studies as following a trajectory that should lead to its own demise. And of course, academics are always so possessive of the objects of their study. So let me say that what for me occasions a rethinking of the relationship between abolition and feminism are some relatively new political developments within the Obama administration, and also, surprisingly or not, within ultra-conservative political circles. Developments that appear to be responses to a popular and increasingly growing concern that the prison project, if it ever was useful, which is doubtful, has entirely outgrown its effectiveness today. So 2 months ago, the Attorney General, Eric Holder, proclaimed, and I'm quoting, that it is time to fundamentally reconsider laws that permanently disenfranchise people who are no longer under federal or state supervision. Some of you may have heard that comment that I think was in a talk he gave at Georgetown University. But Holder was referring to the approximately 6 million people in the US who are permanently barred from voting, that is to say, permanently consigned to a state of civil death because of a prior felony conviction. Some of you may be aware of the Ban the Box campaign and of the Abolish the Box campaign on college and university campuses. At NYU, for example, and Columbia, they have recently begun a campaign to compel the administration or admissions officials to remove that box that asks whether you've ever been convicted of a crime as one of the requirements for admission. So I'm just putting that out there. But if we consider that the Attorney General has finally acknowledged, after so many years of campaigning at the grassroots level, that felony disenfranchisement is deeply anti-democratic, let me also say that what is troubling about this statement is that it assumes the unquestioned legitimacy of preventing people in prison or on probation or on parole from exercising the right to vote. Just as we are encouraged often to support the removal of innocent people from death row, as a way of emphasizing that the guilty must then deserve to die. Abolitionist approaches urge us to beware of the conformist and assimilationist logic that often undergirds what appears on its face to be progressive change. And this is not to say that we do not support the turn that Holder has taken or the campaigns to remove innocent, quote, innocent individuals from death row. Rather, it is to say that we assume a more complicated position, that we assume a feminist stance, one might say, which involves critical support for those reforms, thus support, critical support for those reforms, always against a backdrop of continued critique, critical resistance. There was a reason why we decided to call that movement and that organization, some of you may be familiar with critical resistance, some years ago, because we thought that resistance was urgent, it was critical, but also we had to be critical in our resistance. There is an urgent need to address the astronomical growth in the prison population with its huge costs in dollars and human potential. Now, I didn't say that. Those are not my words. Would it surprise you if I told you that the author of these words is Newt Gingrich? Who, along with Jeb Bush and Grover Norquist, is one of the leading members of the organization Right on Crime. It's called Right on Crime. Sometimes it seems like they're saying right on crime. But actually, it shouldn't be so surprising. There has actually been a tradition of conservative engagement with prison issues, at least since the emergence of Charles Colson's prison fellowship. You're familiar with Charles Colson. There may be a generational gap here, but Charles Colson of Watergate fame, who went to prison, he was the kind of surrogate for Nixon in terms of doing prison time. So, as a matter of fact, actually I'm talking about a lot of my graduate students. I have another graduate student who wrote a dissertation and a book that was published called Native Americans and the Christian Right, the Gendered Politics of Unlikely Alliances. Her name is Andrea Smith. And she followed Charles Colson from the time he was released and began to construct what is now probably the largest prison reform organization in the world. And as a matter of fact, we were very wary when we learned around the time that we were organizing critical resistance that he had adopted our language of the prison industrial complex. Now, I can't say that these figures have been welcomed into the ranks of anti-prison activists, or if they have, I can't say it. I want to know who has welcomed them. It's kind of like welcoming Abraham Lincoln when he was an open advocate of black colonization into the ranks of the advocates of abolition democracy. Of course, most people think of him as the major advocate of abolition. But in it's interesting that on December 31st, 1862, which is the day before, January 1st, 1863, which was the Emancipation Proclamation, right? We just celebrated the sesquicentennial of the Emancipation Proclamation last year. But on the day before, he endorsed a contract to use federal funds to remove some 5,000 black men, women, and children to a small island off the coast of Haiti. Now, as far as Gingrich and Norquist and Bush and others are concerned, those who are associated with that organization Right on Crime, their strategies are all about saving money and about creating the small government that conservative Republicans advocate. The conservatives thus see mass incarceration quite simply as a project that continues to demand financial resources from the government, a project that is, at least in part, responsible for an increasingly big government. And of course, they're not thinking about the global impact of the prison industrial complex. They're not thinking about the way the World Bank and the IMF have clearly encouraged the replacement of expensive but unprofitable social services such as education and housing and so forth and so on, with prisons. And not only with prisons, but prisons that operate for profit. As a matter of fact, as it turns out, the largest private company employer on the continent of Africa is a private security and private prison company by the name of G4S. As a matter of fact, G4S is the third largest corporation, the third largest private corporation in the world. Third only behind Walmart is number one. Everybody knows that, right? And Foxconn is number two. And perhaps if we have time towards the end, I'll talk a little bit about the campaign against G4S that is being waged in connection with BDS, with boycott, divestment, and sanction. And I've been quite involved in that campaign, bringing, again, issues of the prison industrial complex in the U.S. Into conversation with the larger prison space in occupied Palestine. Gaza and the West Bank are the largest open-air prisons in the world, making use of the same kind of carceral technologies that are used inside prisons. Now, I say this because the conservatives are not thinking about reimagining and rebuilding a society that would not require these institutions, that would not continue to profit from racism and class exploitation and heteropatriarchy and transphobia and war. In other words, they are certainly not thinking about feminism. They're not thinking about abolition. And so it surprises me when people sometimes think, oh, isn't it wonderful that we're gaining support in circles we never thought would produce such support. My position has always been, we should acknowledge it, and it's a good thing, because in part it's an indication of the fact that we've been doing the work that we need to do. But rather than simply welcoming them with open arms, we should ask ourselves, where do we go from here? the very fact that they have embraced the campaign is an indication that we need to move in new directions. We need to reformulate our strategies and our ideas. So, because they're not thinking about democracy. And this discussion about feminism and abolition is precisely about future prospects of democracy. So Norquist and Gingrich are calling for prison reform. And as a matter of fact, they propose carceral alternatives, like parole, more probation, more parole, more house arrests, more GPS bracelets, and other modes of carcerality that are parasitically attached to the prison system and which rely on the prison system for their effectiveness. And I think that precisely at this conjuncture, we need to encourage an understanding of what feminism and abolition have to offer each other. This in the context of also understanding some of the dangers of reform, and recognizing that if one looks at the history of the institution of the prison, one sees that each era of reform has produced a stronger and more repressive system. But reformed institutions also retain those historical memories. And so there are congealed memories of collisions between democracy and slavery that are embedded in these institutions. Precisely because so many of the deep structural aspects of slavery were never gotten rid of when slavery was putatively destroyed, they still remain hidden in the social and psychic structures of our contemporary world. And what we tend to do is simply target the embarrassing individuals, the Donald Sterlings of the world, right? Without looking deep into the structures, we will never be able to purge our worlds of this persisting racism. The memories of slavery remain embedded in capital punishment. And the persistence of racism today is the only real explanation for the routine use of capital punishment in the United States when every other industrial democracy, every other capitalist industrial democracy has abolished the death penalty. Nowhere is the persistence of state violence more evident than in the prison system. Violence to the body, as well as violence to the spirit. And as a matter of fact, the shift described by Foucault does not entirely capture the state of US prisons today. And this is because Foucault was addressing a genealogy of the prisons that is largely based on the assumption that the prisons, the penitentiaries in the Northeast represent the most important historical moment in the development of imprisonment as punishment in the US. That is to say, the prisons in Pennsylvania and New York, the Philadelphia system, or the Auburn system, which were putatively about rehabilitation through reflection, penitentiary, right? Penitence. What isn't taken into consideration is the role that slavery played in retaining that torture and violence. And another genealogy that would include the convict lease systems, and that would would look at the ways in which prisons in Alabama and Texas and Louisiana, Angola, of course, have actually come to shape the larger punishment system in this country today. And we can see the extent to which it reaches out to places like Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo and so forth. I think it's really important always to look at the global dimensions. The seclusion of the prison has furthered a tendency to shut everything else out. I mean, it's interesting because it used to be, here I am going off script again, but it used to be that prisons were tourist destinations. And people spent their vacation visiting prisons. You know, look at Eastern State Penitentiary in Cherry Hill, right outside of Philadelphia, which was one of the first structures with indoor plumbing. But that's another story. But the fact that the institution itself is as much as it occupies central places on the political, social landscape of the U.S., most of us, if we have not been in prison ourselves, or if we don't have family in prison, or if we haven't gotten involved in a prison activist group, end up not only not visiting a prison, but not being aware of it. It sort of inhabits the edges of our consciousness. I live in the San Francisco Bay Area, and if any of you have ever been on the freeway 101 going towards the Bay Bridge, and if you going over to Oakland, if you look to the right just before you get to the Bay Bridge, you'll see the San Francisco County Jail there. But many people think it's a museum, you know, because it has these opaque windows. If you look closely through the opaque windows, you can actually see the cells. But most people don't even assume that could be possible. And so this seclusion of the prison sort of makes it fold in upon itself. The prison equals the prison equals the prison, a kind of identity-based equation that narrowly constructs the prison as only that which is within its own boundary. And therefore, when we think of the prison crisis, we assume that it primarily involves men, because the overwhelming majority of the more than 2 million people behind bars are men. But what if we considered the reach of the prison industrial complex? That is to say, not simply the prison, but as I was saying before, the sets of relations that keep this institution in place. Then we would have to ask, how does it help to perpetuate gender violence? How does it help to perpetuate gender violence in intimate settings as well as institutional settings? And I think Audre Lorde can help us here. And I was looking at your T-shirt because, of course, she always insisted on a politics of articulation, even in her self-presentation. She always represented herself as Black, lesbian, mother, warrior, poet. And this was the very groundwork of what came to be regarded as the central feminist approach of intersectionality. In a conversation with James Baldwin, she insisted that there must be some way of curtailing and eliminating the violence that saturates Black communities. And so when Baldwin speaks about blood flowing in the streets. Lord answers, the cops are killing the men, and the men are killing the women. I'm talking about rape. I'm talking about murder. The circuits of violence, the connections between state violence and police violence and domestic violence. Audre Lorde insisted to James Baldwin so many years ago that black men have a special responsibility to work against the violence that is pandemic, that unfolds every evening, that claims women's lives, their sense of self, their futures. And of course, since that conversation, we've developed a greater awareness of the epistemic violence that is inherent in the binary construction of gender. So as Audre Lorde argued against the racial exclusions clinging to the category woman, we have to acknowledge the gender exclusions from what purported to represent the oppressiveness of gender. And so perhaps we can talk about this further during the question and answer period. But let me say that it is precisely the theoretical and practical work against the prison industrial complex, the convergence of feminism and abolition, that has brought to light the extent to which the repression of the space that is rendered invisible by the prison's insistence on conventional gender modes. And understanding this and standing up for the rights of trans prisoners has thus become absolutely central to abolitionist work. Many of us have attempted to broaden engagements with the prison, certainly beyond the disciplines that have traditionally claimed ownership of the prison as the object of their studies. We've been inspired by Stuart Hall. And I mention Stuart Hall both because, unfortunately, he passed away in the month of January, but also because there's a new edition of that germinal work, Policing the Crisis. And I've always thought that it was the best model of critical and collaborative interdisciplinarity that we have. And those of you who are familiar with it, you will know that the goal of that study is to understand the phenomenon of mugging during the Thatcher era. So they start with the question, what is mugging? But in a move that recalls the trajectory of capital, and I'm talking about Karl Marx's Capital, Das Kapital, which begins with an attempt to understand the commodity. What is the commodity? And of course, as the volumes are written, the first volume, the second volume, the third volume, and then the fourth volume, which has several volumes, it becomes clear that one cannot understand the commodity without understanding the workings of the entire system. And so Stuart Hall and his collaborators, and this was a collaboratively conceived and written work, they realize that they have to understand the crisis of capitalism at that moment. They realize that they have to understand the crisis of the relation of social forces that are engendered by that deep rupture at the economic level. They also have to understand the crisis of the state. I especially wanted to include this since the theme is crisis, times of crisis. And they also have to understand the crisis in political legitimacy and social authority, that is to say, the crisis in hegemony. And we know that Stuart Hall was very much influenced by Antonio Gramsci and his theories of hegemony. And so it is with the phenomenon of what we call of what is referred to as mass incarceration. And I mean, I like that term. I think it's okay. I think it works. And I think that the book by Michelle Alexander on the new Jim Crow, mass incarceration in an era of colorblindness, has been so important to the process of generating discussion in so many circles about this. But I do think that we have to go beyond that framework, because there's a global dimension that we have to attend to. And mass incarceration, it's never enough simply to examine the statistics regarding incarceration. And somehow or another, with the influences of the social sciences, and statistics becomes really central. And statistics, I think statistics, that's an important field. It's an extremely important field. But it's not the essence of knowledge. And sometimes we come to assume that all we have to do is know the numbers. And incidentally, in Policing the Crisis, there's a really wonderful critique of the uses and misuses of statistics. So it is never simply enough to examine the statistics regarding incarceration, but rather the conjunctural moments. And I'm actually using another term that comes from Stuart Hall and Gramsci. The associated developments, and among other things, the balance of political forces. And so during the final section of this talk, I want to consider how we might create closer associations between abolition and the immigrant rights movement, thus further exploring the theme of how feminism enables a more capacious comprehension of the reach of the prison industrial complex. And so, as you know, Obama has set a new record with respect to deportations. The most deportations of any president, spending more on immigration enforcement. In immigrant rights circles, he's now known as the deporter-in-chief. Now, which isn't to say that I would like to be living with Romney in the White House, but I have to always say that. We have to remember that, right? And it's important to keep these things in tension, right? And to know that we could be deeply critical of Obama and then say it was a good thing that he was elected, right? I think that's a feminist position. So a significant portion of funds for immigration enforcement goes to private companies that profiteer off the misery of people who are without papers. For-profit prison operators hold almost 2/3 of all immigrants detained every day in federally funded facilities. And of course, private prison corporations have consistently lobbied for increased deportations. Unfortunately, it seems that the government has responded. And you're aware of the role that they played in the formation of the repressive immigration legislation in places like Arizona, but also Georgia and Alabama. Not very long ago, there was an amazing hunger strike. And I think we need to pay more attention to resistance behind bars. Hunger strikes. Last summer, there was a hunger strike in California in which 30,000 prisoners participated. 30,000 prisoners refused to eat. At the same time as there was a major hunger strike in Israeli prisons. This was in March in Tacoma at a detention facility there. It was the Northwest immigrant detention facility located in Tacoma, and it began with about 750 people participating. And within a few days, that number had leapt to 1,200, which was nearly the entire population of that facility. And the news started to spread through, I should say that this was a facility run by Geo Group. Do you all know Geo Group? Geo Group, it's the whole history of private prison companies in this country is really interesting, because Geo Group used to be Wackenhut. And Geo Group is also that company, it's based in Florida, that tried to claim naming rights for the athletic center at Florida Atlantic University, but the students and the faculty said no, and they rose up, and so Geo Group had to withdraw. But within a short period of time, the news spread to another Geo Group facility in Texas, and so they went on strike. And I mention this because of the fact that it recalls the many hunger strikes and re-emphasizes the fact that prisoners only have their bodies. That is the only way in which they can resist. They can only resist with their bodies. And so oftentimes people get really disgusted by hearing about a prisoner throwing feces at a guard. But if you try to imagine yourself in a situation where you're in solitary confinement, where you have absolutely nothing, and you still want to say no, what would you do? So I think it's really important to demystify those modes of resistance and to recognize that they have been divested of every possibility of resisting, and they're left with only their bodies and what they put into their bodies and what is secreted by their bodies. Now, I was saying that the hunger strike in California coincided with last summer with a major hunger strike in Israeli prisons. And I'm always so surprised by how difficult it is to achieve global consciousness in our communities. Why are people here not flocking into the ranks of the immigrant rights movement and making connections with similar movements all over the world? This is an issue that is being confronted everywhere in the world, not only in the North, but also in the global South as well. Look at South Africa. They have a major problem with immigrants from places like Angola and Mozambique, and serious issues. The private security companies, the private prison corporations have made those connections. And I'm wondering, why are we so far behind? The Israeli historian Ilan Pappé, in his amazing book, The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, when he discusses the demographic problem there, he points out that after 9/11, increases in the Palestinian population inside Israel became increasingly referred to as Muslim. In Israel, they refer to people who are citizens of Israel are referred to as Arab because, of course, Palestinian-Israeli would be a conflict in nationalities. And because, you know, Palestinian is a nationality. And incidentally, it's interesting that nationality trumps citizenship if you look at the way in which laws function. Israel often refers to itself as a democratic country where all citizens have the rights of citizenship. And that may be true, but if you are Jewish, you have rights of nationality, which involves another layer of rights that you do not have. You have the right of return, for example. And Palestinians are not able to enjoy the right to return. But the fact that they began to refer to them as Muslim in the aftermath of 9/11 was an attempt to capitalize on the global anti-Muslim racism spearheaded by the US in the aftermath of 9/11. And he says, this is Pape, who's an amazing historian, a Jewish Israeli historian. He says, in the run-up to the 2006 Knesset election, pundits discussed the question of the demographic balance using language akin to that employed by the majority population in Europe and the United States in debates over immigration and how to absorb or deter immigrants. In Palestine, however, it is the immigrant community that decides the future of the indigenous people, not the other way around. Looking at Palestine compels us to acknowledge that modes of racism, apartheid, for example, which we assumed were abolished with the end of South African apartheid, have not been deposited into the dustbin of history. We should be especially interested in the numerous ways in which the US is deeply implicated in the Israeli military and carceral processes. And I should point out that there is significant resistance inside Israel, significant Jewish resistance inside Israel. And it's always important to point that out because somehow or another we have come to believe that even though we can stand up to governments all over the world, we can stand up to our own government. We can stand up even to a government that's headed by a black man, but somehow or another it's wrong to criticize Israel. And that's bizarre. That's really bizarre. The story of the interrelationships between feminism and abolition has no appropriate end. And with this conversation, we have just begun to explore a few of its dimensions. I hope that you will continue this exploration and that we will find new ways of sharing ideas and producing new communities of resistance that unite us in new and ongoing quests for freedom. So I want to conclude with some really powerful words of Chandra Mohanty, who has been really pivotal in the creation of what we often refer to as anti-racist transnational feminism. And so she says that we should always connect our analysis to the politics of movements, making feminist analysis dangerous to empire. Engaging in dissent based on careful analysis, being present and visible as feminist and anti-war, anti-globalization, prison abolitionist, pro-worker, immigrant, queer, and disability rights movements. Distinguishing between imperial or colonizing feminisms and anti-imperialist feminisms. And finally, she writes, it means believing that another world is possible and acting on it. Thank you. someone, do we have time for some exchange? Okay. No. Does anybody have any comments or questions?
Professor.
Hi, Professor Davis. Thank you so much for coming. I was wondering if you could talk about this connection between the United States, Israel, and South Africa in terms of the size of their prison populations and their character as settler colonies. Is there some connection between the identity as a settler colony?
Well, I think it's so good that you raised the question of settler colonialism, because what is it that we always forget here? That we are living, studying, and doing everything we do on colonized land. And it's so important never to forget that. And you know, even when we look at, say, Black history, and we look at the history of slavery, and we see the campaign for 40 acres and a mule, we don't think to ask, well, whose 40 acres was that really? You know? And so that's where I think feminism can help us to, you know, weave all of these strands together. You know, and certainly, you know, recognizing Israel as Israel is really now the only settler colonial nation that's trying to expand. And this, despite the UN, and even oftentimes despite some feeble resistance on the part of the US, because colonies, you know, settlements are expanding inside occupied Palestine. And there are segregated highways linking settlements. So it's not just that there are new settlements, but that companies like Veolia, which I don't know if you all have Super Shuttle, if you've heard of Super Shuttle, airport transportation, but also lots of other forms of transportation. But Veolia provides buses that are segregated in the sense that they only transport Jewish settlers from one settlement to another. And then and Palestinians aren't even allowed to drive on those highways because they're different license plates. So when I went to Palestine a few years ago, I was stunned by the similarities between Jim Crow racism and the signs. You know, they didn't say, they said white and colored, of course, when I was growing up, but now they say authorized. You know, authorized vehicles or authorized pedestrians. There are even streets in places like Hebron that are segregated that Palestinians cannot walk down. So, yeah, I think, and I don't know whether people in this country know that. You know, somehow or another, there's a kind of immunity that attaches to Israel so that information about what is really going on and about the resistance that's happening inside Israel itself, largely among women and young Israeli Jews, which is reminiscent of the struggle against segregation in the US and the allies that developed in that campaign. So yeah, I think that we really need to make that connection. And certainly with South Africa, South Africa was really the first place where there was widespread support for BDS. And you know, South Africa is a complicated place because now, especially given the last election, it so militates against what we thought was supposed to be the promise for the planet. But let's hold on to that promise. Again, you know, just as we hold on to the election of Obama, which created planetary euphoria. You know? I mean, if there wasn't a moment, I don't think there's ever been a moment like that where people literally all over the world were celebrating and where we felt ourselves a part of a community. And that really didn't have too much to do with the individual Obama. It had to do with what was accomplished by people who got involved in that campaign and refused to believe that it was impossible to elect a black person to the presidency. So we have to hold on to that. We can't forget that, just as we can't forget the promise of South Africa. But thank you so much for that question. Okay. Anybody else?
Hi, my name is Ross, and I work at an elementary school in Southeast DC. And I can very accurately say that I haven't worked with a single student whose parents haven't been or aren't currently incarcerated. And I worry about my students a lot because, as statistics show, students who have incarcerated parents are more likely to be incarcerated themselves. And seeing as a lot of schools in my community are, at least the way I view them, are engines that sort of perpetuate the same poverty that surrounds them. I was wondering if you could shed more light on the shift in terms of reform to education in a time where we have institutions of higher learning that are being closed down just to build prisons on that same land. I've heard a lot of discourse about, well, if it's just a reallocation of finances should help prioritize education over the prison system, but I feel like it's not really that simple.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. It is not so simple because when we say, for example, schools not jails, education not incarceration, we don't necessarily think about the ways in which those institutions are so thoroughly entangled with each other that the situation that we are experiencing today would not be possible without the complicity of the institutions of education. And if privatization of prisons acknowledges we acknowledge in witnessing privatization and corporatization of prisons the extent to which punishment itself has become profitable, we also have to look at the commodification of education. Some of the same forces are affecting education. And then, many scholars and activists have been concerned for some time with the school-to-prison pipeline. And they point out that especially in poor communities, communities of color, schools look, more like places of detention than they do places of learning. And so we don't want more schools like that. We don't want more education that is inaccessible. Not only inaccessible because of the extent to which it has become so expensive, but inaccessible to people who really want to learn, in the sense that it places more emphasis on professionalization and subordinates the process of learning to careers and money and all of that, so that you completely forget what it means to have this time as students, and of course you'll never have time like that ever again as students on campuses like this, as graduate students, where you will be able to devote all of your time to learning. And that learning is going to shape you for the rest of your lives. And if you think of it as learning because you want to get a job that's going to make you a lot of money, then you have completely you completely misapprehended what education is supposed to be about in the first place. So this is why abolition is not only about getting rid of these places we call prisons and juvenile detention facilities. It's about reconceptualizing the whole social landscape. And it's certainly about reconceptualizing, reimagining education. But thank you for the work that you're doing. You're working on the front lines. That's hard. It's really hard. And just remember that you have the opportunity to touch someone. And there may be, one or two or three or four who end up not being devoured by that pipeline. And there are also some good people. I have a friend who is a librarian at the Alameda County Juvenile Detention Facility, which is not too far from my house. And so one of my resolutions for some time has been to spend time at the institutions that are in my neighborhood and not just forget about it and ignore it. So I go into the juvenile justice facility and talk to the kids, and this librarian, Amy Cheney, has developed an amazing program that's called Right to Read, WRITE, to read. And she invites authors who have published books. And then she gets the funds to purchase one of the books for every single kid who participates in the program. And so the kids get to read the books, the writers come in and talk about it, and it's whenever I go in, every time I publish a new book, I go in, and then sometimes when I haven't published a new book. But I mean, it's so moving, because here are these kids who are supposed to be, dangerous, and they've been kicked out of school, and, they're mostly Black and Latino and Native American. And every time I go there, all of them want a hug. The boys as well as the girls. So it's just, and then I listen to them talking about the fact that they want to go to college. And, a lot of them know about universities all over the country. And they ask, well, where would they really like to go? And, some of them say, oh, I want to go to NYU. I want to go to Columbia. So it's just so sad that their dreams are so stifled that they, often end up spending the rest of their lives behind bars. But you can touch some of the students. There's some of those students in that program, Right to Read, have gotten into junior college and started to study. And then some of them have actually gone on from junior college to UC Berkeley. So it's possible. It really is possible. And I think that, I don't know whether, does Dartmouth have a prison education program? Where you go into prisons and, huh? Oh, okay, yeah, right, you were telling me about that. So what is the institution? Sullivan County Correctional Facility. And do faculty, many faculty? It's only you, okay, so. Right. Great. Well, I think it's really important for students and faculty to go into these institutions, begin to break the isolation. A friend of mine who's an amazing historian, whose name is David Roediger, and he has been teaching at the University of Illinois, Champaign-Urbana for a long time. And he was telling me that he decided to go in and teach a course because there's a major prison education program there. And he went in to teach a course, and he kind of went in thinking, oh, this is going to be my contribution. Right, this is what I will contribute. And he said he was so transformed by that, that he knows that he got a lot more from that experience than the prisoners. One of the things he said was that he assigned one of his books, and if you know his work, he's written a lot of books, from Wages of Whiteness. And so he assigned one book and then went to class, and the guys were saying, oh, Professor Roediger, in this book you said such and such, but in the book that you wrote like 10 years ago, this was your position on this. And then you said, and he said, oh my God, I have to prepare much more than I have to prepare for my college students. But you know, it really transformed him. And almost everybody that I have talked to who has gone in to do this work, they indicate that they themselves feel that they've been much more transformed than the students they work with behind bars. So I think this is something that's so important. NYU is just developing a new prison education program. Columbia has one, and didn't Como announce that there was supposed to be that some large amount of money was going to be devoted to prison education? Because see, there is no prison education, consistent prison education across the country because of what the Clinton administration did when they withdrew Pell funds from prisoners in 1994. And as a result, all of the institutions have been dismantled that were funded by federal monies under the Pell Grant program.
I grew up in the Sudan, so I became familiar with Free Angela when we started to read the writings of Fatima Ahmad Ibrahim. So yes, we grew up with Free Angela concept as concept, and also a way to open horizons. I am visiting from Georgetown University, and we do have prison education where so many of my colleagues are participating in. So, and it is life transforming. Just, you mentioned Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo and so on. What are your thoughts on that, especially on Guantanamo? I'm just looking forward to hearing what your thoughts are.
Well, I think many of us voted for Obama because he said that he was going to immediately dismantle Guantanamo, right? You remember that? And here we are, like, what, 6 years later? And not only is it still standing, but it is the site of torture, and it's the site of the most egregious forms of injustice. If I had time, I would give you my whole analysis of that, but I'll have to do it very succinctly. The prison is a democratic institution. That's the first point that I make. It's a form of punishment that's only possible in democratic society because it divests people of rights. So it's a rights-based punishment. And so in that sense, it's the quintessential democratic form of punishment. But it's always been kind of the underbelly of democracy. We don't recognize the extent to which that institution informs the kind of democracy we inhabit. And so with all of the revelations regarding Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo and the secret military prisons, it seems to me that that connection finally gets revealed. The face of the US is a prison face. And I don't think we should simply accept that Guantanamo still exists, but we should get involved in campaigns designed to guarantee that it will be closed down. And how many of you know Esperanza Spalding? How many of you like her music? How many of you have seen her Guantanamo videotape? Wow, I can't believe this. Okay, so just Google Esperanza Spalding Guantanamo, and you will see this amazing song that she wrote. And she has a lot of people, Harry Belafonte and Stevie Wonder and others who participate in this effort to demand that Obama shut down Guantanamo. And I think that, I'm using this example because I think that culture plays a great deal plays a really important role in creating a sense of united resistance, communities, progressive communities, radical communities. And many people aren't even aware that musicians and other artists, like Doris Salcedo, whom we saw in the video, many, especially young artists, are so excited about using their work or their passion in the service of social justice. And so, like Christian Scott, how many of you know Christian Scott? Okay. See, jazz is not that popular anymore. But look at the young jazz musicians. Christian Scott, he's amazing. And you never heard his song, Genocide, Genacide? Or his song about Roe v. Wade? Or the one about Proposition 8? And he's an amazing musician, too. Yeah, okay, you can Google Christian Scott. And I think, unfortunately, I'm missing him this weekend. And he's going to be playing at the Jazz Center in San Francisco, which is the only freestanding jazz venue in the country. It has a building of its own, and it's really absolutely wonderful. And Terry Lynn Carrington. As a matter of fact, I'm on one of her albums, not, I'm talking, it's like, yeah, it's an album called Mosaic Project, which is an album with all women, instrumentalists and vocalists. It's an amazing album. And she did another album. Listen to me, I'm talking about music now. She did another album that got a Grammy this year. The first, it's called Money Jungle. It's a cover of Duke Ellington's Money Jungle, which was a trio, Duke Ellington, Max Roach, and Mingus on bass. And so this cover is Terry Lynn Carrington on drums, and she's the leader, of course. Chris McBride on bass. You know Chris McBride. Okay, this is my jazz friend in the back. And then another really wonderful, very young jazz musician named Gerald Clayton. He's Jeff Clayton's nephew. And she became the first woman ever to win a Grammy for jazz instrumentals. And listen to that album. It's all about the financial crisis. It's about capitalism. So anyway, I'm trying to broaden our framework. Okay, and one more question, and I think. Uh-huh. Okay, if we go into prisons, okay. Did everybody hear the question about going into prisons and thus making them appear as if they are more just? Well, see, this is the really important distinction between reform and abolition. Now, abolitionists don't say that we don't need any reforms. And it would be absolutely ridiculous to say we're not going to do anything that makes life better for people behind bars. But you ask the question, is this reform going to make life more habitable for those who are unfortunate enough as to be spending significant portions of their lives behind bars, or is it going to strengthen the institution itself? And one can look at the history of reforms that have strengthened the institution. As a matter of fact, when I was involved way back in the 60s in the campaign against indeterminate sentencing, George Jackson had been sentenced to from 1 year to life. That was his indeterminate sentence. And everybody got indeterminate sentences. So we had, you know, major campaigns all over to get rid of indeterminate sentencing laws. And what do we end up with? Mandatory minimums, 3 strikes. And so as it turned out, that reform was even worse than the process we were trying to get rid of. And it ended up being responsible for the soaring prison populations all over. So you have to ask those kinds of questions. The person who first theorized that is a radical criminologist in Scandinavia. What is his name? His name just eluded me. He wrote a book called Politics of Abolition. Thomas Matheson, Politics of Abolition, back in the early 70s. So he made a distinction between what he called reformist reforms and abolitionist reforms. And I actually work with a women's organization. It's an organization not of women, but that focused specifically on women in prison in Australia. It's called Sisters Inside. And that organization provides services for women who are in prison, services for women who get out of prison, and at the same time it does abolitionist advocacy. And one of the things that was so exciting about that organization for me, which is why I decided to join the advisory board, was because it always insisted on leadership by prisoners who were still inside. Not just former prisoners, but prisoners who were still inside. And there was a point when anybody who wanted to get a job with the organization had about $1 million grant from the government. I mean, in Australia, you could do things like that. It wouldn't work here because if you got $1 million grant from the government, they certainly would not allow you to do abolitionist, advocacy. And so people who were applying for jobs had to go into the prison to be interviewed by the women who were on the management committee. And they also, one of the other things that I often talk about that we did in this organization was to develop a campaign against state sexual assault. And what that was a campaign against strip searching and cavity searching. So it's a feminist way of making the connection between sexual assault and institutional violence. And so, yeah. So you see, it can work. But then on the other hand, the people who are more likely to be led into prison are religious people. Not that that's. I mean, there are some faith-based communities that have done really important work, really important radical work. But then there are those who are only interested in proselytizing, who only go in to convert prisoners, and they're the ones who have the easiest time getting in. So, yeah, we have to, all the time, we have to do a balancing act. Okay, thank you very much.